Hello YouTube. A little while ago I did a video on moral disagreement as a challenge to moral realism. I'll put a link to that video in the description. But I think there's a bit more to say about this topic, and in this video I want to talk about a slightly different take on this argument from disagreement, which comes from an article by Nicolas Smyth called Moral Knowledge and the Genealogy of Error. Basically, moral realists believe that we have moral knowledge. There are moral facts, and most of our moral beliefs correctly describe the moral facts. Most of our moral beliefs are true. Now, Smith says that if we believe this, then we need to provide a theory of error. So this is an explanation of why so many other people and so many other cultures have accepted incorrect moral beliefs. So throughout human history, we find all sorts of practices that are repugnant to us. War, slavery, oppression, genocide, torture, open discrimination of women and other ethnicities, and so on. And these sorts of practices are not merely aberrations. They exist for hundreds of years across many different societies. You find, for instance, in ancient Rome, gladiatorial combat, where slaves would fight to the death for the entertainment of crowds. That was practiced for over 500 years. It's not exactly an aberration. And we don't even have to look very far to find repugnant practices. Even in European cultures just a few hundred years ago, moral attitudes were significantly different in many ways. There was widespread acceptance of slavery and oppression of women and so on. So, if we think that our moral beliefs are mostly true, but then we recognise that other cultures have held radically different moral beliefs, we need to explain why it is that they've gone wrong. Right? What's the difference between us and them that has allowed us to get to the truth while these other people are so far off track? Smith calls this the reliability challenge. If we can't find a relevant difference between ourselves and these other people, no difference which explains, right, why we've found the true beliefs while others end up going wrong, that would suggest that our own beliefs are unreliable. What moral realists need to establish is that our moral beliefs have been produced by a reliable process, by a process that tends to produce true moral beliefs, and that requires explaining how this process differs from the case where people go wrong. So it's quite moral realists will often kind of provide an epistemology of moral belief, and they usually proceed in sort of two steps. So first of all, moral realists will often provide a theory of the moral facts. This is a theory which tells us exactly what the moral facts are like. This is the kind of metaphysical element of realism, right? So what exactly are the moral facts? And then with that as a kind of background, we try to show how it is that our beliefs are sensitive to those facts. We give an explanation for the formation of our moral beliefs, right, that shows how our beliefs track the moral facts. This is the epistemological element of realism. And Smith suggests that there are, broadly speaking, two types of epistemologies that realists might appeal to. So one type of epistemology is provided by causal theories, and you tend to find causal theories being defended by moral naturalists. Naturalists take it that moral facts are ordinary natural facts, and as such, the moral facts have causal powers. So it might be argued, for example, that false moral beliefs lead to immoral behaviour, and immoral behaviour tends to cause social disruption. So there is pressure on societies to move towards moral behaviour, because the moral behaviour promotes social stability. Right, so over time, false moral beliefs are replaced with true moral beliefs. That's a very, very brief outline there. But for more detail on that, see my video, Reductive Moral Naturalism, for an example of a view of this kind. So this kind of theory faces the problem of accounting for widespread long-term moral error. Right? We find when we look at human history, civilizations surviving for long periods of time, despite engaging in practices that we think are deeply morally wrong. Slavery, oppression of women, torture, severe inequality, and so on. if we're claiming that moral facts exert some sort of causal influence such that societies tend to kind of favour the moral behaviour, we need an explanation for this widespread immorality. So that's a theory of error there. An alternative realist epistemology is provided by rationalism. Rationalist explanations tend to be favoured by non-naturalists. So non-naturalists deny that moral properties are natural properties, and they deny that moral properties have causal powers. Rationalist explanations tend to draw comparisons to domains like mathematics, because mathematical entities are abstract, they don't have causal powers, they're not known through empirical investigation. So instead, rationalists will emphasise the capacity for reason. We might say, humans have certain moral intuitions, and we come up with theories designed to accommodate these intuitions. We sort of weigh our moral intuitions against proposed moral principles, sometimes giving up the intuitions, sometimes altering the principles, until we arrive at a kind of reflective equilibrium. So a set of moral principles that accommodates the greatest number of our strongest intuitions, bearing in mind explanatory virtues like simplicity and so on. And then through this process, we have, over the time, gotten closer and closer to the moral truth. Now, of course, this raises the question, well, why did this process take so much time and effort? People in the past possessed, broadly speaking, the same sort of cognitive capacities as us, but they were mistaken. And they weren't just mistaken about highly theoretical claims, they were mistaken about moral truths that we take to be basic and self-evident. It's like people were mistaken about, so to us, slavery is wrong is a simple, basic moral fact, right? But huge numbers of societies apparently just didn't see that. So again, how do we explain this? And I mean, this kind of thing, incidentally, shows the limits of the analogy to reasoning in mathematics. In the case of mathematics, there is no need, or at least there is much less need, for a theory of error, because with mathematics, we don't find deep, fundamental disagreements concerning the mathematical facts. So that's the general problem. And as Smith puts it, he says, if the realist's explanation for how she got things right applies equally well to the belief formation processes of those who got it wrong, the realist no longer has a good explanation for how she got it right. So in the face of widespread moral disagreement, the realist needs a theory of error, which tells us why so many people got things so wrong. It's worth noting an important distinction between this argument and I guess we might call it the reliability challenge. So it's worth noting an important distinction between the reliability challenge and other arguments from disagreement. Often philosophers talk about the argument from disagreement in terms of whether or not moral disputes are resolvable under ideal conditions, where everybody is fully informed and ideally rational. So like the question is, right, would sort of fully informed, ideally rational people disagree about the moral facts? And the thought is that if we can show that fully informed, ideally rational agents would not disagree, then that removes the force of the prevalence of moral disagreement. Actual humans are, after all, ignorant of many facts and far from perfectly rational. So, as long as we can show that we're all going to converge, that removes the problems of moral disagreement. But that kind of move isn't really going to work for the reliability challenge, because in this case, the challenge is to distinguish between the processes that actually formed our moral beliefs and those processes that actually formed the beliefs of other people, other cultures with very different moral commitments. We must explain why it is that those cultures have gone wrong while we have not. And whether or not disagreement is resolvable under ideal conditions is not, at least prima facie, is not relevant to that question. So that is the challenge. Smith then turns to various realist responses, which we will have a look at now. So one option for the realist is to deny that other cultures actually do have a large number of false moral beliefs. The realist can deny that there actually is widespread moral disagreement. And in that case, of course, there's just no need to provide a theory of error. Morality turns out to be more like mathematics. There just really isn't that much variation in people's moral codes. And we only need to provide a theory of error when we find widespread disagreement. If there's just like a few people who hold completely different beliefs to us, that's not going to pose much of a challenge, because even reliable cognitive mechanisms will sometimes go wrong. Reliability doesn't mean perfect reliability. It's enough that cognitive processes that produce moral belief tend to track the truth. So if we can show that most people actually agree with us, then that removes the need for a theory of error. Now, of course, other cultures have very different practices to us, and it seems like they have different moral commitments. But the realist might argue that this is due to the fact that these other people exist in very different conditions. The same moral principles might require different actions in different conditions. And since other cultures live in different conditions, it's to be expected that their moral obligations will be different. Consider cultures that practiced infanticide, such as the Inuit. That certainly looks initially like a deeply repugnant practice, but these people lived in an extremely harsh environment. Food and resources were scarce, and the population had to be tightly controlled, and they just didn't really, they didn't have means of controlling the population other than infanticide. It just wouldn't have been possible to take care of all of the infants being born. So sacrifices had to be made. You're going to have to, like in that situation, if you're in a situation where you simply do not have enough food to feed everybody, then some people are going to have to be left to die. And it makes sense to allow the weaker people to die, right? Like, again, if you're in a situation where you just don't have enough food, you don't have enough resources, then you're going to favour the strong, independent people who can sort of take care of themselves over infants who require, years and years of care before they become independent. If we found ourselves living in these sorts of conditions, we might also consider infanticide acceptable. So, in fact, these people were not making any kind of moral error. Recall I mentioned that, naturalists sometimes think, and I talk about this again in the reductive moral naturalism video, they will sometimes say that true moral beliefs are those that correspond to norms that promote social stability and overall welfare. Well, in harsh conditions, such as those in which the Inuit lived, what look to us like very brutal norms might be the best option. So this is one thing we might say is, well, there actually isn't disagreement here. So a couple of problems with this. First of all, the scope of this kind of explanation is going to be very limited. One point which is raised by Jesse Prinz in his book, The Emotional Construction of Morals, is it's true that if modern people found themselves in a desperate survival situation outside of civilization with few resources available, they might resort to infanticide. But for the vast majority of us, that would be a horrifying, debilitating moral dilemma. We would see it as, at best, a necessary evil, but very much an evil, a great sacrifice required in order to save ourselves and others from something worse. But it would be horrifying. It would, scar you for life. It's that kind of thing. But in many of the cultures that practiced infanticide, it wasn't seen as an evil at all. It was just routine, which, if that is correct as a description of how these cultures saw it, that suggests that they are in fact operating with very different moral values. There's a big difference between just viewing an action as just a sort of routine form of population control. I suppose it's sort of like how at least some people in the West today might view abortion, right? Like if somebody is pro-choice, they might just view abortion as a kind of birth control, right? It's just not a big deal. It's very different from something that is like a devastating moral dilemma. And that suggests that there's still a difference in values here. But in any case, it's quite easy to find practices that can't be explained in this way anyway, right? That were practices that are just straightforwardly incompatible with our values, even bearing in mind different conditions of life. It's very hard to see what justification we could give for practices like bride kidnapping or female genital mutilation or brutal execution methods like crucifixion or the oppression, even execution of homosexuals or spousal rape. Even in many places in the West, spousal rape was legal into the 20th century. What justification is there for that, right? Like, you can't. Again, even if you accept that, oh well, people lived in harsh conditions. Yeah, so what? That doesn't mean what? How is that justifying rape? So it's hard to see any plausible conditions that would lead us to think that practices like these are acceptable. And so we find, looking at other cultures, a host of false moral beliefs, even bearing in mind the different living conditions of those cultures. Okay, a second response is that other cultures do have false moral beliefs, right? We can accept that they do have false moral beliefs, but that these beliefs are explained by non-moral errors. Moral disagreements arise from different beliefs about the non-moral facts. Consider slavery in the American South. Defenders of slavery argued that black people were less intelligent, more impulsive, more prone to violence, and so on. Basically, that the cognitive capacities of black people were severely deficient with respect to white people. Defenders of slavery argued that the slaves were well taken care of, and that slavery actually improved the prospects of the black race. By putting black people to work, we are helping to civilize them. So slavery was defended as being the best option, not just for white people, but also for black people. So what we have here are just a host of false, non-moral beliefs, right? Like the claim that slaves were treated compassionately. Well, that's just a sort of straightforward empirical claim that's false, right? The claim that black people were, irrational and violent and so on. Again, this is a straightforward empirical claim that's false. Similarly, when women were denied the same rights as men, this was justified on the grounds that women were intellectually inferior and more prone to hysteria and so on. So, so moral error here is explained by non-moral error. And this isn't an ad hoc explanation, because we already know that people in the past and in other cultures have had a host of incorrect non-moral beliefs. Okay, a couple of worries about this response. First, although we might well be able to find people citing non-moral beliefs in support of institutions like slavery or oppression of women, it's worth asking, do these non-moral beliefs actually justify the practices in question? So the non-moral belief underlying the oppression of other races and sexes was that there are innate fundamental differences in the reasoning abilities of different types of humans, and that actually these what to us are clearly oppressive practices were, that's an expression of compassion, right? Like slaves were treated well, and by putting slaves to work, this is civilizing them and so on, right? So these sorts of claims. Suppose we grant all of that, right? Just assume that all of that is true. Would it justify slavery? Well, it seems to me it wouldn't, and I don't think that would be a particularly unusual reaction. So, like, even if we grant all of the non-moral claims that defenders of slavery made, right? Even if we grant that slaves were being treated compassionately and that blacks are less intelligent and all of this stuff, I think most of us would still regard slavery with horror. And indeed, it is worth noting that many slavery abolitionists were outright racists. They didn't defend slavery abolitionism by appealing to notions of like fundamental equality, because they didn't believe that races did have equal capacities. They just objected to the coercion and the deprivation of liberty that was involved in enslaving somebody. And I think that's probably an attitude that people today have towards slavery. So even though the defense of slavery often drew on false non-moral beliefs, it still involved false moral beliefs as well. So the moral belief that it is permissible to enslave other races provided they have lesser cognitive capacities and provided they are treated well, I mean, and when I say treated well, I guess, like, provided we're not just like beating them up for no reason and so on. Oh, well, it's okay to enslave them. I don't think most of us today would accept that, right? We would just object to the deprivation of people's liberties and autonomy. It's like that's just an oppressive institution. People should have the right to, forge their own path in life. I think that's a pretty common view, and this suggests that there is still a significant difference in moral values here. Another difficulty for the appeal to false non-moral belief, which is raised by Smyth in his article, is that very often non-moral beliefs don't actually explain moral beliefs, because non-moral beliefs function as post hoc rationalizations of moral beliefs. So that is, people have certain moral commitments, and then they will search for whatever factual claims are available in order to justify those commitments. But the moral commitments come first, right? So in fact, non-moral disagreement is driven by moral disagreement, not the other way around. Smyth appeals to Jonathan Haidt's social intuitionist model of moral judgment and work on moral dumbfounding. According to the social intuitionist model, moral judgments usually arise from moral intuitions, which are immediate automatic reactions where like particular forms of behavior are just seen as good or bad, or like felt to be good or bad. That we just have this like immediate kind of reaction of approbation or disapprobation towards certain forms of behavior. Our moral intuitions are largely inculcated by social forces. So we tend to adopt the same sort of effective responses as other members of our community. We tend to value the same sorts of things as other members of our community. We pick up our values, either through direct education or just through observing the reactions of others, in much the same way as, I suppose, we pick up things like language, right? It's a largely non-rational process. It's just like, maybe a better example actually would be like aesthetic tastes or tastes in food or something like that, right? Like this is just something we pick up from the culture in that kind of way. Now, so anyway, yeah, so we have these moral intuitions and these drive moral judgments. Now, once a moral judgment has been made, people will then search for justifications to rationalize it. So obviously we do engage in moral reasoning, but reasoning has the role of supplying post hoc rationalizations of moral judgments. It's much more rare for people to reason their way into a moral judgment. It's not that we start out with an open mind and then use reasoning to figure out what our moral judgment should be. We just make a moral judgment as a result of, intuitions that are inculcated in us by our culture, and then we engage in reasoning to rationalize it. So an example of this kind of thing is, again, Haidt's work on moral dumbfounding. So consider this story. In a study, Haidt gives people this story. Julie and Mark are brother and sister. They are travelling together in France on summer vacation from college. One night they are staying alone in a cabin near the beach. They decide it would be interesting and fun if they tried making love. At the very least, it would be a new experience for each of them. Julie was already taking birth control pills, but Mark uses a condom too, just to be safe. They both enjoy making love, but they decide not to do it again. They keep that night as a special secret, which makes them feel even closer to each other. What do you think about that? Was it okay for them to make love? So when presented with this story, people, generally speaking, form an immediate judgment that the behaviour is morally wrong. And if you ask them why it's morally wrong, they will begin searching for reasons. But even when these reasons are shown not to apply in this particular case, they don't change their judgment. So, for example, it's quite common for people to point to the dangers of inbreeding. But, of course, Julie and Mark have been very careful to use birth control to prevent that. And I suppose if you were to really insist that there's always a risk, which, well, I suppose is true, you could actually just modify the scenario so that it's John and Mark rather than Julie and Mark. But anyway, the point is, right? We can show that inbreeding just isn't a risk here, but people still feel it's wrong. Or they might say that, well, Julie and Mark are going to harm themselves, they're going to be hurt emotionally, but then the story makes clear that no harm occurs. Maybe it's going to affect their relationships with others, but then the story makes clear that this is something they've only done once and they're not going to do it again. So basically, people will kind of give these justifications, but they don't apply in this particular case. Eventually, people hit a dead end, right? They can't come up with any reasons why it's wrong, but they insist, nevertheless, that it is wrong, that they know it's wrong. So they know it's wrong, but they can't explain why. And often, when people are presented with this scenario, that they'll explicitly say that. They'll say, like, oh yeah, I know this is wrong, but I can't explain why. And this is what Haidt calls moral dumbfounding. So it seems like what's happening here is that people have this sort of gut reaction, this immediate intuition of revulsion towards incest, which is driving the judgment that the behaviour is wrong, and then they search for justifications for that reaction. As Haidt puts it, they become lawyers trying to build a case, not judges searching for the truth. They know that incest is wrong. They just need to come up with reasons why. I quote, "One puts forth argument after argument, never wavering in the conviction that it is wrong, even after one's last argument has been shot down. And even if no further arguments can be found, it's unlikely that their judgment will change. They know it's wrong, they just can't explain why." So people remain fully confident in their moral judgments, even when the factual justifications that are offered are shown to be false. Now, if this model is on the right lines, then non-moral beliefs don't explain moral beliefs, at least in many cases. The moral belief comes first, and then various non-moral beliefs are adopted in order to justify it. So if people in the past had come to believe that there are not significant differences in the rationality or intelligence of white people and black people, would they drop their support for slavery, or would they just find other justifications, right? I mean, so the social intuitionist model suggests it's likely that their moral commitments would be unaffected. They would just search for other justifications. If you could really convince them that actually black people are no less intelligent than white people, they would still be able to find other justifications for their commitment to slavery. So anyway, if this model is right, then there's a serious problem with appealing to non-moral disagreement in the context of the reliability challenge, because the reliability challenge says the realist needs to provide an explanation of moral error. But errors in non-moral beliefs that are used to rationalize moral positions don't explain the moral error, because the moral error is prior to the non-moral error, right? Like the non-moral belief isn't explaining why people form the moral commitments that they do. And that's what we need to talk about in order to answer the reliability challenge. The realist needs to say something about the processes that have actually led us to accept the moral beliefs that we accept. Okay, a third response appeals to distorting factors. The realist can argue that there are various social and psychological forces that tend to push people towards false moral beliefs. People in the past were subject to these factors to a degree that we are not. So that explains the prevalence of false moral belief in the past. These sorts of distorting factors might include the following. So first of all, people are self-interested. They will tend to form moral beliefs that they assume will promote their own self-interest. So people will support norms and policies that they think will make them better off. And this may not be intentional. People often fail to see things from the perspective of others. They fail to realise what it's like to be in other people's shoes, and this may lead them to discount the experiences of other people. Defenders of slavery, for example, may genuinely just not have realised how awful it was to be a slave. I guess another sort of related thing here is that moral beliefs may be distorted by class interests. People will focus on what will make their class better off rather than on the general welfare of all. Smyth suggests that in the medieval period, ideas like the divine right of kings were tailor-made to promote the welfare specifically of elites. I suppose you find, kind of the sort of moral claims that underlie things like the caste system in other cultures, again, that they seem tailor-made to promote the welfare of the higher castes. Powerful people are biased towards their own welfare, so they will develop ideologies that promote the welfare of the powerful classes, and they will use their power to construct institutions that promulgate such ideologies, and that is a significant distorting force. Third, there is organised religion. Very often this promotes a kind of mob mentality and dogmatic adherence to particular moral rules, and this results in an uncritical acceptance of rules that hinders moral inquiry. Many religious rules, even if they made sense in the context in which they were originally developed, no longer promote social welfare, but the followers of the religion may continue to endorse them uncritically. Other aspects of religious mythologies can lead to bias. So in Christianity, God is often described in male terms, while in its origin story, Eve, the female, committed the original sin, and this may bias its followers to misogynistic attitudes. So these are these are various distorting factors which will push people towards incorrect moral beliefs. Now, a difficulty with appealing to distorting factors is that it faces what Smyth calls the symmetry objection. So the explanation for the epistemically impoverished situation of our cultural ancestors applies equally well to us. Basically, we have reason to think that our own moral beliefs will also be affected by these kinds of forces. In the modern world, people are just as much motivated by self-interest, and certainly every individual is sort of trapped in their own perspective, as it were. I can't literally see things from the point of view of another person. And there's a fairly obvious way in which our modern egalitarian liberal attitudes are based on self-interest. I mean, given that I'm not among the rich, powerful elites, it's in my self-interest, for example, for there to be a strong welfare system and for there to be rules against discrimination in employment and so on and so on. You know, a great deal of what we see as moral progress was driven by groups of people affirming their own interests. And furthermore, with respect to things like class forces, well, there are some fairly obvious arguments that the liberal ideals of individualism and property rights and so on are, that they just sort of function as ideological support for the capitalist economic system. So this can be explained by class interests. And it remains as true today as it was in the past that people in powerful positions will favour ideologies that promote their interests, and that they will be able to use their power to construct institutions that promulgate these ideologies. Along the same lines, we can trace many of our current moral beliefs to religious influences. Of course, today, the influence of religion, I guess, is on the wane, but in cultural history, at least according to Smyth, it was Christianity that promoted the ideal of the basic equality of all souls. So, there are all kinds of differences between human beings, but we take such differences to be morally irrelevant. We think, all people have certain basic rights to life, to liberty, property ownership, and so on. And this commitment may well be due to the influence of religions like Christianity. Moreover, even though people today are less likely to endorse religious dogma, that doesn't mean that they're less likely to be dogmatic. It's just that their dogmas are drawn from non-religious communities. And when you think about, notions like individual liberty or equal moral consideration for all people, or norms of property ownership, or the badness of suffering, and so on, I mean, it seems plausible that for many people these kinds of things serve as sort of unquestioned assumptions, and they probably wouldn't even know how to respond to somebody with a radically different value system, who did question these things. So the claim that Smyth makes here is that this appeal to distorting factors is arguably going to run into this problem of symmetry, that we will find that the sort of distorting factors that we use to explain the false moral beliefs of the past are going to apply equally well to us. So actually this isn't, we haven't found a relevant difference, or at least that's Smyth's worry. Okay, the fourth response that Smyth discusses appeals to consistency reasoning. Reasoning about morality often involves locating and eliminating contradictions. A common way of arguing against a person's moral beliefs is by showing that those beliefs are contradictory. And we can explain moral progress in these terms. So suppose that somebody says that P is impermissible and Q is permissible, that P and Q differ only along certain dimensions, and that none of these dimensions is morally irrelevant. Or that none of these dimensions is morally relevant. Well, in that case, we have an inconsistency. Some of the beliefs are going to need to be changed. So, for example, take Peter Singer's drowning child case, in which he asks us to imagine coming across a child drowning in a pond. I could jump in to save the child, but this would ruin my new shoes. Most people think that I have a moral obligation to save the child. It's impermissible for me to let the child die, even though jumping in to save the child would ruin my shoes. By contrast, we think that it's perfectly fine for me not to give money to charity in order to save the life of a child in another country. It's perfectly fine for me to spend money on new shoes rather than give that money to a charity that might, I don't know, purchase malaria nets to save children from a horrible death by malaria. But now Singer says that these two cases differ only with respect to the fact that the child in the other country is far away from us. And Singer takes it to be an intuitive, basic principle that proximity is morally irrelevant. The mere fact that somebody is far away from me, the mere fact that there is distance between me and another person, that doesn't change my moral obligations to them. Well, of course, if we accept all of that, we have an inconsistency in our moral beliefs. And of course, Singer hopes that we will resolve that inconsistency by concluding that it is that we have an obligation to people in other countries. Now that's a simple example, but that kind of reasoning should be familiar. And with this in mind, we can claim that the reason why people in the past went wrong is that they were poor at consistency reasoning. They either did not realise what their moral principles entailed, or they just didn't care. They didn't think through their moral commitments as carefully as we do now. That's why they made such serious moral errors. So this response again raises this problem of symmetry. No doubt people in the past had failures in consistency reasoning, but were they worse at this than us? One important thing to bear in mind here is that what looked like inconsistencies might just be different but consistent moral commitments. The drowning child case is instructive because one obvious response to this case is just to affirm that proximity actually is morally relevant. And that's probably the attitude that would have been prevalent throughout most of human history. Maybe not proximity in itself, but certainly in-group favoritism, right? People took themselves to have special obligations to those who were close to them, to those who were members of their tribe or their community or their country. Indeed, even today, even in modern liberal democracies, I think most people assume that they have much stronger moral commitments to their communities and more broadly to the people of their own country than they do to people in far-off lands. So I imagine a lot of people just wouldn't accept Singer's claim that proximity, distance is morally irrelevant. And this isn't an inconsistency, this is just a clash of values. Or maybe it is an inconsistency, because we might argue that when people affirm the moral relevance of proximity, or when people engage in in-group favoritism, we might say there's still some inconsistency lurking in the background that would need to be argued for. But the problem is we can always say that, right? We can always argue in response to any particular moral position that this position involves some inconsistency. What's not clear is why we should suppose that people of the past would be more likely to end up with such inconsistencies than we are today. If we're going to appeal to inconsistency to explain error, we need to show that we need to show the processes which led people in. We need to show the process which led people in other cultures to inconsistency at a greater rate than us. One obvious point here actually is that we do today have much better tools for consistency reasoning. We have much more sophisticated formal theories. Just look at the developments in formal logic, probability theory, statistical analysis, all that stuff, right? So we have much more sophisticated tools, and that, I suppose, is a difference. On the other hand, how often do people in our societies apply such tools in their moral reasoning? I mean, outside of academic articles, that's pretty rare. And in fact, even professional moral philosophers do not universally use formal methods like this. It really, I think, depends on the field. So if you look at something like population axiology, that tends to be highly formal. But if you look at feminist disability ethics, you sometimes find an explicit rejection of formal methods because these are seen as abstracting away from important features of like people's experiences and contingent social conditions. In fact, I imagine that feminist ethics would probably look at consistency reasoning in general as a very impoverished model of moral judgment. So, you know, like even within academia, the utility of these kinds of tools is disputed. So, like, yes, we have these tools, but it's not clear that we really use them, that most people in our culture use them. Yes, okay, that was consistency reasoning. So a final option that Smyth discusses is intuitionism. And I'm not really sure that this is exactly a theory of error in itself, but this is certainly a very popular realist epistemology. So according to the intuitionist, moral facts are known through intuition. In its stronger form, intuitionism claims that there are certain basic moral facts that are self-evidently true. And the thought here would be, well, as soon as certain moral propositions are correctly understood, their truth is seen immediately. Like that we just apprehend the truth of the... I mean, it's kind of like 1 + 1 = 2, right? Like once you understand what is being claimed, you apprehend its truth, right? It is a clear and distinct idea. And so these can then form the foundation of our moral knowledge, right? We then build up from these clear and distinct truths that are immediately apprehended. That's a stronger form. A weaker form of intuitionism would say, well, we have these moral intuitions. These are sort of like these are kind of intellectual seemings, right? And these provide defeasible evidence. So if it seems to be the case that P is true, that's evidence that P is true, and we are justified in accepting P unless further evidence emerges to the contrary. So we have like intellectual seemings that are analogous to perceptual seemings. I look out my car, I look out my window, I see what looks like a red car, and I form the belief that there's a red car outside. If you ask what justifies this belief, well, I just have a certain like perceptual seeming, right? It seems to be the case that there's a red car out there. I have some perceptual data, and like that's it. Along the same lines, I read about somebody torturing a child, and there's a sort of intellectual seeming, right? I have a reaction of disapprobation to this, and I form the judgment that's wrong, right? That's morally wrong. What justifies my belief that it's morally wrong is it seems to be wrong, and I have no reason to doubt this. That's the general idea. Now, so I mean that's not in itself a theory of error, but that is, as I say, that's a sort of standard epistemology for moral realists, especially non-naturalist realists. So, can this provide a convincing theory of error? Well, on this point, the intuitionist faces some difficulties. One obvious issue here is, of course, the intuitionist could try appealing to the other explanations that we've canvassed, so different factual beliefs, distorting factors, all of that. But, we're putting that aside. Is there something, more unique to intuitionism? Obviously, we can't really appeal here to failures of inference because moral intuitions are not, they're not inferential, right? Like these are just immediate reactions of approbation and disapprobation. So, we find widespread disagreement, even about like certain propositions that we would take to be basic and self-evident. It's kind of as if we were faced with a large number of cultures who, insist that the sky is white or green or red or blue. Like, how do we account for this? Well, one thing we might say is that these other cultures simply failed to properly comprehend the moral claims in question. They made conceptual errors. In itself, that's arguably not a particularly plausible explanation, because many of the moral claims in question are just not all that difficult to understand. I mean, it doesn't require a great deal of conceptual sophistication to understand a claim such as slavery is wrong, or you ought not to kidnap women from neighbouring tribes and force them into marriage, and so on, right? Like, to suppose that people of other cultures simply failed to understand these sorts of simple propositions would arguably be to attribute an uncharitable degree of idiocy to them. But then if we make that move, even if we think that that this does work as an explanation, it then raises the symmetry problem. Because why should we suppose that we are free of similar conceptual errors? And after all, I mean, as Smith points out, I mean, have you ever really sat down and thought carefully about the proposition that actually it's sometimes permissible to kidnap women and force them into marriage? We don't. I mean, most people just don't put much thought into such ideas, naturally enough, because we're committed to egalitarian, liberal, individualist values, right? And we're never in a sort of situation where we have to consider, these sort of wild moral propositions. So yeah, I mean, if we're going to attribute just a failure of conceptual understanding to other peoples, it looks like we're going to face the same criticism ourselves. Like we are just as likely to have failed to understand certain moral propositions. Right, well, okay, those were some of the potential realist responses that are discussed in Smith's article. No doubt there are other potential responses available, but that's all I wanted to talk about today. I hope you found that interesting. Goodbye.